welcome back. This is Jeff Claridge. I'm talking about the jazz clarinet, but this episode, episode number 2, I think, should just be about myself. I'm going to talk a little bit, as short as I can, about my own background and my biases, because I think it's very important. Every teacher you get is going to teach you certain things in a different context and with an emphasis in different ways, and I'm going to address them right now because I think that's important. So, I started playing clarinet when I was 9. I'm 35 now. When I was 9, I hated it. I didn't want anything to do with the clarinet or any music at all. I like Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Superman, the Batman theme, whatever was there at the time. But not this, just exciting music before the Pavlov's theory of it's exciting and then it sets you up right for the entertainment of the actual TV show or movie you're watching. Love songs meant nothing to me. A couple years after that, I was forced into doing something about music, presenting a song, and I had no idea what song I would pick. Eventually, I picked a Sing, Sing, Sing by Benny Goodman, and it opened up a world for me there eventually. Not necessarily immediately, but I slowly gained an appreciation. Well, these musicians, A, some of them are improvising. B, it's very masterful. Some of it's very well thought out, and it is beautiful. I could finally appreciate it, and having played a bit of clarinet beforehand, I understood just how difficult all of that is, and how are they coming up with all of that. I might have had 2 or 3 CDs at that point, and there were a couple songs. There was even a 1960 version of Sing 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 by the Combo, where Flip Phillips, the saxophonist playing with Benny Goodman, is quoting Benny's own original solo back to Benny right before Benny starts soloing. That was how I got into it eventually, and I kept playing clarinet, and I started appreciating it more. I enjoyed the challenge, and then I got into jazz. There were jazz bands at school, which the clarinet wasn't a part of, but all the same, I did it anyways. I picked up the trumpet, then I picked up the saxophone, took lessons with an amazing teacher, Tom Koklo, and went from there. I have a background in saxophone more than clarinet, which is the only weird thing, because there weren't any jazz clarinet teachers at either of the schools. Well, I've gone to 3 schools, but the jazz schools I went to, they just did not have a jazz clarinet teacher. The faculty might say they did at the time, but no, they're saxophonists. I think one of my original school cap does now with James Danderfer, but other than that, I don't think the University of Toronto even now has a clarinet teacher. Not for jazz. Anyways, what I love most of all, I'll talk about the difference between Benny Goodman and Artie Shaw eventually, but just to give you a general perspective, these are kind of the 2 original titans of the music industry. In the late 1930s, Benny Goodman was basically the Hollywood superstar in terms of music, one of the very first ones, an instrumentalist who everyone knew, eventually worldwide. And yeah, I'll talk about him later. But a lot of clarinetists talk about the difference between the 2 of them and which one they prefer. Almost everyone I've ever talked to, clarinetist or otherwise, in that argument always says Artie Shaw is better. And I completely understand why they say that. When you listen to the difference between Artie Shaw and Benny Goodman, Artie Shaw is outlining the chord changes. That might be too much information for young students, my demographic, but basically what the piano player and the bass player are playing. Whatever they are, Artie Shaw is following it a whole lot more carefully. And he's doing it in a very pattern-based way a lot of the time, but not perfectly patterned. You just outline, the way that the musical language went. Artie Shaw is doing that before that happened. He's not exactly a bebop musician, but you can hear how he leans towards that more without knowing. And then he did have a bebop album, and then his last music was playing kind of with bebop musicians in the small group recordings, in 1953. And yeah, his language just works that way. Whereas Benny Goodman's doesn't. Benny Goodman's solos are less transcribable. There's less information in them that is worth studying, you can argue. So almost every clarinetist I've talked to would prefer Artie Shaw. I'm the opposite. There's only one other person I know who is also the opposite, I think Ben McRae. But Benny has always been not just the clarinet. He's been so much more to me. There is a joy in his playing and in the band's playing. There's an energy, there's a connectedness, there's a modern sound to it, even from like the 30, 35, 38, 1938. I mean, the way that they're playing, the way he innovated, but the way he listened and the way he would take charge when his musicians weren't necessarily as good, the way he was trying to lead them into further places. When I listen to Benny Goodman, I listen to Benny's sound, but I also, and there's also old recordings, it's sometimes hard to hear his sound. Um, but I hear the energy and the joy that not just his playing is doing, but how he's leading it, how he's feeding it to other players. And he's playing with some of the best. So that overall, it could be a big band album, this Benny Goodman Orchestra, and there's just a little bit of clarinet in it. But I love his band more than almost any other band because it's an amazing band, and then it also has this clarinet, this extra section, this extra sound that just takes it over the top. Um, that's a bias compared to almost anyone else I've talked to, and I should address it. Um, I have a lot of experience now with bebop and with more modern jazz. I can play it. I'm strong in the jazz, but the simplism of simplicity of Benny's music is always my favorite. I've got original albums, and I would still any day would rather play Benny Goodman's music than my own. Not necessarily that the audience does. Um, that said, there's so much more. There's so much better. In terms of the six musicians who I'm going to be talking about, in kind of the order I'm talking about is the order that I discovered them, which might be important for you to know. Artie Shaw I kind of discovered probably the same day or the day afterwards. I just didn't like. I mean, his music's amazing, but the difference between Benny and I guess Artie and Buddy and let's say Eddie Daniels is that I can listen to Benny for weeks and weeks and weeks on end. And the other three, I think I would be annoyed after listening to them for about more than 2 hours straight. Um, there's something about, the way that they play that is so near perfect, but maybe less inspiring, over a longer period of time. I don't really know how else to explain it. Maybe it's because when I'm listening to Benny Goodman, I'm listening to Mel Powell and Teddy Wilson, Red Norvo, Lionel Hampton, Cootie Williams, Charlie Christian, Wardell Gray, like all the amazing musicians who play with Benny, who are more inspiring overall than the musicians who Artie Shaw played with. Artie played with some amazing musicians, but all the same. So hopefully I'm looking a little bit at the bigger picture, which hopefully helps a young student hear the rest of the jazz, the music that's going on around, the music that I'm going to show you. But yeah, I love Artie Shaw. His sound, his playing is amazing. I'll get into him. I love Buddy DeFranco, and eventually I got into Tony Scott. Tony Scott is one of those weird cases who is one of the best. There's no question based on his results in the 50s. But also just how crazy he went and how many different sounds he went after. He kept trying to innovate long after he probably should have. So I find him inspiring that way. Eddie Daniels is just one of the most unbelievable musicians of all time. There's no question. And yeah, I'll get into him later. The only other thing I should say, my favorite clarinet sound of all time is Richard Stoltzman. I heard him live once. Apparently it wasn't a good concert, according to everyone else who was there, but I was a young kid, and I just fell in love with that sound. I can hear Benny Goodman in it. I can hear that warmness, that roundness, that openness, and the playfulness, because he also improvises a little bit. Not that the concert was about improvising. And probably my favorite clarinetist who I've heard live is Sabine Meyer. She uses a different clarinet. So for a student studying this instrument, unless you live in Germany and somehow get into contact with a Wurlitzer clarinet, the sound is just different. When I listened to her a few times, like certain notes, like the shallow mo range and certain other things just didn't sound like the same note to me. It was like an alien kind of clarinet. and the resistance is different in the instrument she's playing as well. But she just she took my breath away every time. Like, not the sound, any single note, but the story she told with it. It was spellbinding how she went. One of the pieces was I think the Mozart quintet, and the other time I can't remember what she was playing. It didn't matter. It had nothing to do with it. Yeah, and I don't talk about Jimmy Giuffre. I've done a lot of studying of Jimmy Giuffre's earlier stuff. I absolutely love his playing. But Fusion and Thesis, maybe I've played one or two of those songs live. I can't remember. He's kind of a different case. Maybe I'll get into him. That's about it, I think. Hopefully that wasn't too long. I'll talk about these other clarinets later in good time. Thank you.